The lock on my own front door wouldn't turn. I stood there at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, keys in hand, jiggling the same brass key I'd used for 2 years, and it just spun in the cylinder like it had never met that door before. I thought maybe the cold had warped something, even though it was only October and barely 40 degrees. I tried again. Nothing. Then I noticed the porch light was on, which was strange because I always left it off, and through the gap in the curtains I didn't own, I saw movement. Someone was in my kitchen. I'm going to back up because none of this makes sense without the rest of it, and the rest of it is the part that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just say I'm the younger one. 2 years younger than my sister Renata, who has spent most of our adult lives making sure everyone in a 20-foot radius understood the hierarchy between us. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the first real sentence I remember her saying to me when I was maybe 7 and she was 9 was, "You're going to need me your whole life, you know that, right?" I didn't even understand what she meant. I just remember the tone, calm, almost bored, like she was reading me a weather report. She wasn't wrong about much else in her life. Good grades, good job, married a guy with a steady income and a golf handicap, but she made absolutely sure I knew which one of us was supposed to be the disappointment. When I dropped out of community college at 20 to work full time and save money, she told our mother in front of me, well, someone's got to be the cautionary tale. When I got my first real job at a logistics company doing scheduling and inventory work, she asked if I was still doing the warehouse thing, even after I'd been promoted twice. When I told the family I was buying a real house, 3 bed, 2 bath, nothing fancy but mine, she laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, a disbelieving one. With what money, she said, did you win the lottery? I hadn't won the lottery. I'd worked 12-hour shifts for 6 years, lived with 3 roommates the entire time, drove a car with 210,000 miles on it, and put every spare dollar into a savings account I never told anyone about, including my parents. When I finally had enough for a solid down payment, I found a place 40 minutes outside the city, a little 3 bedroom that had been a foreclosure, fixed up just enough that I could move in without doing much work myself. I closed on it in March. I cried in the car afterward, alone, because nobody else was there to see it, and because for the first time in my entire life, I had something that was unquestionably mine, that nobody could take credit for or attach a comment to. I should have known that wouldn't last. It started small, the way these things always do. Renata called in April, a few weeks after I moved in, and said she and her husband Dale were going through a rough patch and needed somewhere to stay just for a little while. I want to be clear that I didn't hate my sister. I loved her in the complicated, blockaded way you love someone who's been cruel to you your whole life, but who also held your hand in a hospital waiting room once, who also remembers your childhood the way nobody else alive does. So when she asked, I said yes. I told myself it would be a couple weeks. I gave her the smaller bedroom, the one I hadn't burnished yet, the one I'd been planning to turn into an office. 2 weeks became a month. A month became, we're still working things out with the lawyer. I didn't push. I had a job that kept me out of the house 10 hours a day. And when I was home, Renata was mostly pleasant. In the surface way, she'd always been pleasant when it cost her nothing. She made comments here and there about my furniture, about my budget grocery choices, about how I really should think about getting nicer dishes if I ever wanted to have people over. But I let them slide off me because that's what I'd trained myself to do for 31 years. What I didn't notice, not for a long time, was how much space she was taking up that wasn't just physical. It started with the thermostat. I'd come home and find it set 4 degrees warmer than I'd left it. Every single day, like clockwork. When I asked her about it, she said, Dale runs cold, in a tone that suggested I should have already known and adjusted my own life around it. Then it was the parking. I had a driveway that fit 2 cars comfortably. Somehow, within 6 weeks, there were 3 vehicles parked there most nights, mine, Dale's truck, and Renata's car, and I started parking on the street in front of my own house, telling myself it wasn't a big deal. Then there was the mail. I noticed it on a Saturday morning in June, flipping through a stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. Most of it was junk, but 2 pieces stopped me cold. One was a county tax document addressed to Renata and Dale, last name, at my address. The other was a credit card statement, same names, same address. I remember standing there holding those 2 envelopes for what felt like 5 minutes, just turning them over in my hands like they might explain themselves if I looked long enough. I brought it up that night as casually as I could manage, which in retrospect was probably too casual because Renata barely looked up from her phone. Oh yeah, she said. We updated our address with a few things. It's easier since we're here right now. For how long though? I asked. It's been 3 months. It's been 10 weeks. She said, like the correction mattered, like it changed anything. And it's not like it's hurting you. It's just an address on paper. I didn't have a comeback for that in the moment. I wanted to say something about how an address on paper is not nothing, how it's the difference between a guest and a resident, how the county and credit card companies and probably eventually the post office were going to start treating my house as her house. But I didn't say it. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself this was just Renata being Renata, taking up space because she'd never had to think twice about whether she was allowed to. That should have been my first real alarm. I ignored it because I was tired, and because some old, exhausted part of me still wanted her approval more than I wanted to be right. By July, Dale had started parking his truck directly behind my car every single morning, which meant I had to knock on the guest room door at 6:30 before my shift to ask him to move it every single day, like clockwork, like he genuinely could not learn this pattern. I started leaving 15 minutes earlier just to account for the inevitable delay. I never said anything about it directly to him. He had a way of going quiet and wounded if you criticized anything. The kind of quiet that made you feel like the unreasonable one for even bringing it up. And Renata would always step in to smooth it over in a way that somehow made me feel worse. He's had a hard year, she'd say. Can you just be a little more patient? I want to take a second here and say something that I think matters for the rest of this story. I am not a confrontational person. I have spent my whole life being the one who absorbs things, who lets things go, who decides the fight isn't worth it. I used to think that made me peaceful. I since learned it mostly just made me easy to walk over, and that the people most likely to walk over you are the ones who grew up learning, the same way I did, exactly how far they could go. In August, my coworker Priya, one of the only people I'd actually told the full situation to, asked me a question that I couldn't shake for days afterward. Have you actually seen Elise anywhere? Like, did you two ever sign anything? I told her no, obviously not. It's my sister. Why would we need Elise? Because then there's nothing in writing that says she's a guest and not a tenant, Priya said. If this goes on long enough, some places consider that residency. You want to be careful. I laughed it off at the time. I told her she was being paranoid, that Renata might be a lot of things, but she wasn't trying to steal my house. I genuinely believe that. I want that on the record because it makes what happened next feel even more absurd in hindsight. The kind of thing you only fully understand once you're standing outside in the cold trying to get into your own home. September is when things started moving fast, even though at the time it felt like nothing was moving at all. I came home from a double shift to find that the spare bedroom, the one Renata and Dale had been using, now had a brand new lock on the inside of the door. Not on the outside, where it would make sense for privacy from someone passing by. On the inside, which meant it was meant to keep someone out who was trying to get in. When I asked about it, Renata said it was for peace of mind, that Dale didn't like the original doorknob, that it was a small thing. Why was I making it a thing? I didn't push. Again. I keep saying that phrase because it's the thread running through this whole year. I didn't push, I let it go, I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. And I think part of why I'm telling this story now is so somebody else reading it might push sooner than I did. Around the same time, my mail started disappearing. Not all of it, just specific pieces. A letter from my mortgage servicer by her about an escrow adjustment. A notice from the county about a property assessment. Things that, if I'd read them promptly, might have told me something was wrong faster than it eventually did. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I assumed I'd misplaced them, or that they'd gotten swept into recycling by accident. Mail goes missing. It happens. It wasn't until late September that I found out it wasn't an accident. I was getting ready for work, half asleep, looking for a charger cable I thought I'd left on the kitchen counter, when I opened one of the drawers, not a drawer I normally used, one of the junk drawers near the side door, and found a small stack of envelopes, all addressed to me, all already opened. A mortgage statement, a property tax notice, a letter from my insurance company about a policy renewal, all opened. All read clearly, based on how the pages had been refolded slightly wrong, the way you refold something when you're trying to make it look untouched, but you're in a hurry, all hidden in a drawer I almost never used. I stood there in my work clothes holding a half-eaten granola bar in one hand and a fistful of my own opened mail in the other, and for the first time since Renata had moved in, I felt something other than tired resignation. I felt afraid. Not of her exactly, afraid of what it meant that someone in my own house had been quietly reading my financial documents and hiding them from me for who knows how long. I didn't say anything that morning. I went to work. I sat through a 10-hour shift, barely able to focus, running through every interaction I'd had with Renata over the past 6 months, trying to figure out what I'd missed, what she might have been doing with information she had no business having. That night, I asked her directly. I tried to keep my voice even. Why is my mail hidden in the side drawer? She didn't even flinch. That's the part that got me. The complete absence of surprise, like she'd rehearsed this moment, like she'd been waiting for me to ask so she could deliver a line she'd already prepared. I was just keeping things organized for you, she said. You never check your mail on time, and some of that stuff looked important, so I held onto it so it wouldn't get lost in the shuffle. I was going to give it to you eventually. You opened it, I said. I opened it because I was trying to help. God, you act like I committed a crime. It's addressed to me, at my house, about my mortgage. It's also my house right now, she said, and then, before I could even process that sentence, she added, almost as an afterthought, like she was talking about the weather. Mom thinks I should have told you about the refinance thing months ago, but I didn't want to stress you out. I remember the exact physical sensation of hearing that sentence. It was like the floor tilted 3 inches to the left. What refinance thing? She sighed, the kind of sigh that says you're the unreasonable one for not already knowing something she'd decided not to tell you. Dale's been talking to a guy about restructuring some of our debt, and your name came up because of the address situation. And it's honestly not that big a deal, but there might be some paperwork with your name on it because of the joint address. I told him it was fine because it's basically just administrative. I sat down. I actually had to sit down right there at my own kitchen table because my legs didn't feel entirely reliable. You put my name on something for Dale's debt. It's not on anything. It's just, okay, you're spiraling. I can see you spiraling. Let's not do this tonight. I want to tell you, I immediately grabbed my laptop and pulled my credit report and got to the bottom of it that same night. I didn't. I want this story to be honest, even in the parts where I didn't act as fast or as smart as I wish I had. What I actually did was lie awake until almost 3 in the morning, replaying every detail, trying to decide if I was overreacting, if this was actually as bad as it felt, or if I was just exhausted and catastrophizing the way I sometimes do. I pulled my credit report 2 days later on my lunch break, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the warehouse, because some instinct told me not to do it from a computer in my own house. There was a new credit account, opened in July, a secured line of credit, $4,000, tied to a hard inquiry I had never authorized, listed at my address with a notation that the application had included a cosigner reference, Dale's name, for a household refinance consolidation, whatever that meant in practice. I am not a lawyer, and I'm not going to pretend I fully understood the mechanics of it even now. What I understood, sitting in that parking lot with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, was that someone had used my information in some capacity without telling me to open something I had never agreed to. I called my bank that afternoon on a break I wasn't technically supposed to be taking, and the woman on the phone was kind but very clear this wasn't something they could just undo over a phone call. I need to file a dispute, possibly a fraud report, and depending on how the account had actually been structured, whether it was truly in my name or just associated through the address, or whether my identity had been used more directly than that, this could take weeks or months to sort out. I want to pause here and say something because I think this is the part of the story where people usually expect the big blow up, the screaming match, the dramatic confrontation where I throw her out on the spot. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, honestly, scarier because it made me realize how much groundwork had already been laid without my noticing. I went home that night and I didn't say anything. I sat at the table while Renata reheated leftovers and talked about a coworker's vacation photos, completely normal, completely unbothered, while I watched her like I was watching a stranger wearing my sister's face. Dale came in round 8, gave me a nod, disappeared into the spare room with its new inside lock. I remember thinking, he knows. Whatever this is, he knows more than he's letting on, and that lock isn't for privacy. It's so I can't get a clear look at whatever's in there. I didn't sleep that night either. I made a decision instead, lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan I'd installed myself the month after closing on the house, back when this was still just a happy, ordinary home and not whatever it had become. I decided I needed proof before I said another word. The next morning, before my shift, I called a locksmith. Not for my front door, which still worked fine at that point, but for advice. I asked hypothetically if someone other than the homeowner could legally change a lock inside a house without the homeowner's permission. He laughed a little, not unkindly, and said no, not really, but that it happens more than people think, especially in family situations, and that the bigger issue is usually proving who actually has rightful access once things get messy. He told me something I hadn't thought about: get documentation early. Photos, dates, anything showing who's been living there and for how long. Because if it ever became a legal question, paper trails mattered more than feelings. So I started building one quietly. I photographed the mail I found in the drawer before I said anything about it to anyone else, even though I'd already confronted Renata once. I started keeping a log on my phone, dated entries, almost like a diary, noting every strange thing: the new lock, the credit inquiry, the vehicles in the driveway, the thermostat, all of it. I felt a little insane doing it, sneaking around in my own house, writing down observations like a detective in a story I didn't want to be the main character of. But some instinct told me this wasn't going to resolve itself with a calm conversation. Some instinct told me Renata had already decided, somewhere along the way, that this house was functionally hers and that I was the variable that needed to be managed rather than the person whose home it actually was. I was right. I just didn't know how right yet. In October, I came home on a Wednesday to find a moving truck, a small one, the kind you rent for a studio apartment, parked across the street. I assumed for one hopeful, naive second that it meant Renata and Dale were finally leaving. I actually felt something close to relief walking up to my own front door. The truck wasn't for them leaving. It was for them moving more things in. I stood in my driveway and watched Dale and a guy I didn't recognize carry a couch. Not my couch, a different couch, beige, with a tear on one arm, through my front door and into my living room, where they pushed my actual furniture against the wall to make room for it. I asked what was happening. Renata, standing on the porch with a clipboard like she was running a logistics operation, told me, breezily, that they were consolidating some of Dale's mom's old furniture because his mother was downsizing and they didn't want to pay for storage. "This is my living room," I said. "It's temporary," she said. "Everything's temporary right now. You know that." I want to be honest about something. By this point, I had started to suspect that temporary had become a word Renata used the way other people use punctuation. A placeholder that didn't actually mean anything, inserted automatically into every sentence, regardless of whether it was true. That night, I sat down and actually looked, for the first time in months, at my mortgage statement, the actual current one, not an old one buried in a drawer. The escrow had been adjusted. Not dramatically, but enough that my monthly payment had crept up by about $90 a month since the spring, and I hadn't noticed because I'd been auto-paying without checking the breakdown, the way most people do when they trust the number on the screen. $90 a month for 7 months is $630 I hadn't accounted for. It wasn't nothing. And buried in the explanation of the adjustment was a line about an insurance rider update that I didn't remember requesting. I called my insurance company the next day on my lunch break, sitting in the same parking spot as before, like it had become my designated place for receiving bad news. The agent told me that back in June, someone had called in using information that matched enough of my identity verification questions to add an additional named insured to the homeowner's policy. Renata's name. Not as a tenant disclosure, which would have been reasonable and something I might have agreed to if asked properly. As an additional named insured, with rights that, depending on how things were eventually interpreted, could complicate any future claim, any future sale, any future refinance, because now there were two names with an interest in that policy instead of one. I asked how that was even possible without my direct authorization. The agent, to her credit, sounded genuinely uncomfortable. She said sometimes verification questions can be passed if the caller has access to enough personal information: date of birth, last four of social security number, mother's maiden name, that kind of thing. Information that, if you live with someone, or used to be close with someone, or grew up in the same house as someone, isn't actually that hard to know. I sat in that car for a long time after I hung up. I want to tell you what was going through my head, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters most, more than any individual document or lock or piece of furniture. What was going through my head was a memory, completely unrelated on the surface, but it kept surfacing, of being 9 years old and watching Renata, 11 at the time, calmly explain to our mother why she deserved my allowance that week because she'd done more chores, even though I had the chart, even though I had proof, and watching our mother nod along because Renata had said it with such total unblinking confidence that the truth of the chart didn't matter as much as the conviction in her voice. She had been doing this exact same thing, in slightly larger and slightly more legally significant ways, for almost 30 years. I had just never been the one with something big enough at stake for it to actually break something. I started talking to a lawyer in late October, not because I had decided to fight yet. I genuinely hadn't, not fully. Some exhausted part of me still wanted to believe there was a version of this where Renata realized what she'd done and fixed it without my having to escalate anything, but because I needed to understand what my actual rights were, given how blurred the lines had become. The lawyer, a woman named Carla who specialized in landlord, tenant, and family property disputes, listened to the whole timeline without interrupting once. And when I finished, she was quiet for a second before she said something I haven't forgotten. You've let this go on long enough that some of what you're describing could legally resemble a residency dispute, not just a family disagreement. I need you to understand that clearly, because the longer it continues, the more complicated it becomes to remove them, even though it's your house, even though your name is the only one on the deed. How is that possible? I said. It's my house. Because tenancy isn't only created by a lease, she said. In a lot of places, it can be implied by conduct, length of stay, contribution to expenses, mail, vehicle registration, utility accounts, the things you've already told me about. None of that means they own anything. But it can mean that legally removing them isn't as simple as changing the locks one afternoon while they're at work, even though every instinct in your body is probably telling you to do exactly that. I told her that was exactly what I wanted to do. I know, she said. And I need you to not do it yet, because if you do it wrong, you could end up the one in legal trouble, and that would hand her exactly the kind of leverage she clearly knows how to use. So I waited. I documented more. I gathered bank statements, the credit report, the insurance call records, photographs, the dated log on my phone that I'd been keeping since September. Carla helped me draft a formal written notice. Not a screaming confrontation, not an emotional appeal, just a calm, dated, legally framed letter establishing, clearly and on paper, that Renata and Dale's presence in the house had always been understood as temporary, guest-based without any rental agreement, and that I was now formally requesting them to vacate by a specific date, with the date chosen carefully to satisfy whatever minimum notice period applied where I lived. I handed her that letter on a Sunday morning in November, at the kitchen table, with my hands actually shaking, which embarrassed me at the time, but which I don't feel embarrassed about anymore. She read it. She read it slowly, twice, and then she looked up at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before in 31 years. Not anger exactly, something colder and more calculating, like she was recalculating a budget in real time. "You're seriously doing this?" she said. "I gave you almost 8 months," I said. I found my own mail hidden in a drawer. I found a credit account I never opened. I found my insurance policy with your name added without me knowing. I'm not doing anything to you. I'm asking you to leave my house. After everything I've done for you, she said, and I want to write down exactly what she said next because I think about it more than almost anything else in this whole story. You'd still be nothing without people like me showing you how the world actually works. You think you built this house by yourself? You think anyone respects what you have? I have been the only person in this family willing to tell you the truth about herself since we were kids, and this is what I get. I didn't yell. I want that on the record too, because for years I assumed that if a moment like that ever came, I'd finally lose it, finally say all the things I'd swallowed since childhood. Instead, I just said, very quietly, "You're not telling me the truth about myself. You're telling me what you need me to believe, so I keep being small enough for you to manage." She didn't have a comeback for that. I think it's the first time in our entire lives I'd said something to her that she couldn't immediately spin into a sentence that put me back in my place. That was the last calm conversation we had. Dale moved out within a week and a half, quietly, almost sheepishly, taking his truck and most of the beige furniture, leaving without much of a fight, which told me a lot about whose decision this whole arrangement had actually been from the start. Renata did not move out. Renata instead escalated. She told our mother I was throwing my own sister out on the street during a divorce, which was a generous interpretation of events that conveniently left out the fraudulent credit account, the insurance policy, the opened mail, the new lock, and the 8 months of overstaying a temporary arrangement. My mother called me, crying, genuinely distressed, and I had to sit on the phone for 40 minutes explaining things I shouldn't have had to explain, producing screenshots of bank statements to my own mother to prove that her other daughter had opened a credit line using my information. My mother believed me, eventually, but it cost something between us that I don't think fully healed by the time all this was over. Some small erosion of the assumption that family tells you the whole story. Renata refused to leave by the date in the letter. She told me, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed, that she wasn't going anywhere until this was settled properly, whatever that meant, and that if I tried anything, she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. That's when the lock incident happened, the one I started this story with. I came home that Tuesday night in late November after a closed-door meeting with Carla that afternoon where she told me the formal eviction-style process, given the residency questions, was going to take a minimum of several more weeks through the right channels, and that I needed to be patient even though every cell in my body wanted this over immediately. I pulled into my own driveway. My key didn't turn. The porch light, which I never left on, was glowing warm in yellow to curtains that weren't mine, and through the gap I could see someone moving around in my kitchen like they belonged there. I stood on my own porch, in the cold, locked out of a house with my name on the deed, and I genuinely did not know for about 30 seconds whether to laugh or to call the police. I called the police. I want to be careful here because I know how this could sound, and I don't want to pretend it was simple or satisfying in the moment, because it wasn't. Two officers came out, polite, a little weary, the kind of weary that comes from having handled 100 family disputes that all sound the same after a while. I showed them the deed on my phone, the property tax bill with my name on it, the dated notice letter Carla had helped me draft weeks earlier with a clear vacate date that had already passed. Renata answered the door eventually, calm, articulate, doing the thing she's always done, speaking with such total confidence that for a second even the officers seemed to hesitate, glancing between us like they were trying to figure out which version of events to believe. But documents don't argue back the way people do. The deed had my name. The tax bill had my name. The vacate letter had a clear date, properly delivered, properly documented, exactly like Carla had told me to do it. One of the officers told Renata, not unkindly, that this had moved past a conversation they could mediate and into something that needed to go through the courts if she intended to contest it. But that for tonight, since this was clearly my legal residence, I had the right to access my own home. She let me in. She didn't have a choice. But she made sure to tell the officers loudly as I walked past her into my own living room that I was the kind of person who calls the cops on his own family, in a tone clearly meant for an audience that wasn't there. I didn't sleep at the house that night. I went to a motel because something about being under the same roof felt unsafe in a way I couldn't fully articulate, and I didn't trust what either of us might do or say at 1 in the morning with that much tension still in the room. I lay in a motel bed that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and felt, for the first time in months, something close to clarity. Not relief, not yet, just clarity. This was actually happening. This was actually how far it had gone. And it was actually going to end, because I had finally done the one thing I'd avoided doing my whole life. I had put something in writing, with dates, with my name on it, that said, "This is mine and you do not get to decide otherwise, just because you're louder than me." The legal process took another 6 weeks after that. I won't pretend it was a clean, dramatic finale because real life mostly isn't. There were two court dates, both of which Renata attended with a kind of theatrical wounded dignity that almost would have been impressive if it weren't being performed at my expense. There was a formal dispute filed with the credit bureau and the bank regarding the fraudulent account, which eventually got closed and removed from my report, though it took a notarized identity theft affidavit and almost 4 months of waiting to fully clear. There was a separate call with my insurance company to formally remove Renata as a named insured, which the agent told me, with something like relief in her voice, should have required your direct sign-off in the first place, and I'm sorry that it didn't. The court ultimately sided with me because the deed has my name, and only my name, because the documentation Carla and I had built was airtight, dated, unambiguous. Renata was given a final move-out date with a sheriff's enforcement clause attached if she didn't comply, which is the kind of sentence I never thought I'd write about my own sister. But there it is. She moved out on a Thursday in January, almost exactly 9 months after she'd first asked for just a couple weeks. I wasn't even there when it happened. I was at work, and Carla had arranged for the move to be supervised so there wouldn't be any disputes about what left the house and what stayed. I came home that evening to a house that was, for the first time in nearly a year, entirely and unambiguously mine again. The thermostat was still set 4 degrees too warm. The beige couch with the torn arm was gone. The spare room door had no lock at all anymore. Carla had insisted, during the supervised move-out, that whatever lock had been installed without my permission be removed before anyone left, just so there could be no ambiguity later about who controlled access to what. I sat in my living room that night in the quiet, in a house that finally sounded like only my own footsteps again, and I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt something quieter than that. Something more like the specific relief of finally putting down something heavy you'd convinced yourself you were strong enough to keep carrying forever. My mother and I talked it through slowly over the following months. She apologized eventually for believing the first version of the story she'd heard, though I think some part of her still struggles to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the one who'd quietly used a credit application and an insurance policy as leverage against her own sibling. Renata and I have not spoken since the court date. I've heard through her mother that she and Dale did finalize their divorce, that she's renting an apartment across town, that she's told mutual friends a version of this story where I'm the villain who abandoned family during a crisis. I've decided I don't need to correct that version for an audience I don't owe anything to. The people who actually matter already know what happened because I made sure, this time, to have it all written down. I think about that line she said the night I handed her the notice more than almost anything else from that whole year. You'd still be nothing without people like me showing you how the world actually works. I used to believe some version of that sentence, on some quiet level, for most of my life, that whatever I built, whatever I achieved, was somehow smaller or less real because it hadn't been validated by her first. It took watching her try to legally annex my own house out from under me, using my mail and my information and my name on documents I never signed, to finally understand that the sentence had never been about me at all. It was about her need to be the one holding the leash, regardless of whether there was actually anything at the other end of it worth controlling. I changed the locks again in February, this time on my own terms, with a deadbolt I picked out myself, in a hardware store, alone, on a Saturday afternoon that belonged to nobody but me. I stood in my driveway afterward and looked at my house, my actual house, the one with my name on the deed and nobody else's, the one I'd cried over alone in a car 18 months earlier. And for the first time since the whole thing started, it finally felt entirely uncomplicatedly mine again. She said I'd never amount to anything. By spring, she was living in the house I built from nothing, trying to convince a county clerk and an insurance company and two police officers that it was somehow hers too. I think, in the end, that tells you a lot more about her than it ever did about me.